For 18 years, the community in Craig County, including many members of the media, have followed the case of the deaths of Danny and Kathy Freeman, the mysterious disappearance of their 16-year-old daughter, Ashley Freeman, and Ashley's friend, 16-year-old Laura Bible, and the arson of the Freeman family home. Yesterday, there was an arrest in the case. OSBI investigator Tammy Ferrari and my SVU investigator Gary Stansel, through incredible police work, identified 3 perpetrators, 2 of whom have since died since the beginning of the investigation.
The turn of the millennium would mark a tragic event in Welch, Oklahoma, in Craig County. On the early morning of December 30th, 1999, an inferno engulfed a trailer owned by Danny and Kathy Freeman. Their 40-acre property was lit up for neighbors to see. Neighbor Jack Bell saw the fire as he drove to work. The trailer was likely burning for hours by this point. Bell went to another neighbor, Kathy Merrick's house, and told her about the fire at the Freeman residence. Cell phones were not the norm in 1999. Merrick called 911, and firefighters and officers from the sheriff's office would come out shortly. There was known to be 4 occupants in the trailer the night before: Danny, wife Kathy, daughter Ashley, who just turned 16, and her best friend Laura Bible. As the officers sifted through the debris in the burnt trailer, they came across the first body. It was Kathy Freeman. She had been shot. Officers on the scene included Sheriff George Vaughn, Under Sheriff Mark Hayes, among others. As soon as the sheriff learned there was a probable homicide, he made the decision to call in Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations. There had been issues in the past between the sheriff's office and Danny and his late son Shane, and it was a conflict of interest for the sheriff's team to investigate. That day, with multiple officers searching, Kathy's body was the only one that was ever found of the 4. The theory was that Danny killed Kathy and then took off with Ashley and Laura. That is to say, until the next day, when Lorene Bible happened to stumble upon Danny Freeman's body in the rubble. He had also been shot in the head. It was strange that with over a dozen people in law enforcement and firefighters looking through the ashes, not one of them found Danny's body. Now 3 members of the Freemans were killed by gunshot, and 1 was possibly kidnapped. And if Ashley was kidnapped, it meant that Laura Bible was also probably kidnapped. And with the sordid history between the Freemans and the sheriff's department, people were starting to suspect they knew who was responsible. Shane Glenn Freeman was a 17-year-old kid who was athletic and overall likable and charismatic guy. He played football and ran track. He could have been looking at a promising future, but he started living a life of rebellion. He wasn't a terrible kid. He was having a tough time at home. He wanted to leave the town of Welch because he was so unhappy there. His friend Justin said Danny was physically abusing him. Shane started making some bad decisions, and the end result would be fatal. Shane had been breaking into houses and stealing cars to go joyriding in. When he'd burglar a home, he would eat the occupants' food and watch their TV, sometimes ordering porn on pay-per-view. Even though it was mainly friends and family that were the victim of his crimes, he could still potentially be charged with a felony and do serious time. One of the houses he had stolen from was the Bible's house. On January 8, 1999, Shane had run away. He had stolen from multiple people and the police were looking for him. A pickup truck that he had stolen had broken down, and the law had finally caught up with him. A sheriff deputy showed up on the scene. He would later claim that Shane pointed a gun at him. He reacted by pulling his shotgun and shooting Shane dead right there. There were no witnesses, and there would be no internal investigation on the matter. It would be classified as a justifiable shooting. The death of Shane destroyed his parents. They knew the story the police gave must have been wrong. They wanted answers, and they weren't being given any. It took 6 hours from the time of the shooting to the time the Freemans were notified of what happened. Shane's family said he would never pull a gun. He would just turn and run away if anything. One red flag all of the town witnessed was that the road it happened on would mysteriously be closed the following day for construction purposes. It looked to everyone like the police were trying to hide something. Danny was so upset that he thought about killing the deputy that shot his son. Danny had been seen driving in the deputy's town a big cabin, asking people if they knew where the deputy lived. When the sheriff found out Danny may have been stalking the deputy, he was intercepted and brought into the station. Allegedly, multiple people from the sheriff's office took turns threatening Danny and his family's life. This had gotten very serious. Eventually, Danny was free to leave the station. He would tell Kathy what happened. He told his brother Dwayne that if anything morbid should happen to him, it was the sheriff's office. Now the Freemans were dead, and 2 innocent teenage girls were missing. Laura Bible and Ashley Freeman had been inseparable friends since they were 6 years old. They were country girls. Danny had taught Ashley how to shoot a gun when she was young, and she would enjoy going hunting with him. The girls had pets of animals you would typically see on a farm or at a zoo. Both girls were athletic and in good shape. Ashley played basketball. Laura was a cheerleader. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, or OSBI, sent an agent to be in charge of the investigation. Laura Bible's mother, Laureen, was not impressed by his appearance nor by the way he investigated. She immediately hired 2 private investigators of her own named Tom Pryor and Joe Dugan. The agent would refuse the PI's help. Tom Pryor found an insurance verification card with a name on it on the Freeman property sometime after the fire. He tried to turn it over to the agent because it could be a potential lead, but the agent wouldn't take it. The significance of this card would not come to light until almost 2 decades later, and it very well could have prevented something horrific from happening, had it been followed up on at the time. The State Bureau agent would be the one in charge of the case early on, but Laureen Bible would be the one doing most of the work to find the girls. Laureen would make the missing person posters and distribute them all throughout town. She would conduct searches of the area, which would consist of hundreds of people helping out. They would check all over, looking into a nearby quarry and wooded areas. Laureen would put her daughter's name in the missing persons database, after the Bureau agent said he would, but never got around to doing it. It was hard to tell at times if the State Bureau was helping or hurting the investigation with their ineptitude. There were 13 guns found in the Freeman trailer, and none of them were tested to see if any was the murder weapon. These were just a few bungles. There were 2 different theories regarding the murders that would divide the Freemans and the Bibles. Dwayne Freeman and his parents strongly believed that the sheriff's department was responsible for the murders. It would be too big of a coincidence to not be true with their history, you would think. State Bureau agent would investigate the sheriff's office. He considered the possibility that harm to the Freemans had come from them. Craig County officers were questioned and polygraph tests were conducted. The findings of the tests were not made public. In any case, the State Bureau was satisfied that nobody in the sheriff's department was involved. The other theory, which is what the Bible family thought, was that the murders were drug-related. Laureen said that Danny was a big player in the drug game, and it must have been over a drug debt or a drug deal gone bad. Dwayne Freeman did not believe that. He admitted that Danny grew a lot of pot, but insisted it was for personal use only. But there may have been some stuff Dwayne didn't know about his brother. Danny had a close friend named Charles Kreider, who lived just over the Kansas border in Chetopa. Charles also had a grow farm. They had met years earlier while they were working for the same welding company together. They would hang out, bond, smoke weed, and trade plants sometimes. But Charles claimed that Danny had started to get into meth. He also said that Danny told him 3 men had visited his trailer a week before the fire and had threatened him. People around town like Laureen Bible had heard about this, but it was not widely known to the public. Charles never went to the police to reveal the identities of these people. It is unlikely they would do anything with this information anyway. And Charles was not known for his credibility. He was known as being a very bizarre person. Not only that, he was dangerous. A little more than 4 years after the Freeman murders, Charles would go on to murder a co-worker of his named Judith Trum. They worked at a school where Charles was a janitor and she was a cook. Judith was strangled to death and thrown into a creek like garbage. Somehow Charles only had to serve 14 years after being convicted of second-degree murder. It is my understanding that he also has to register as a sex offender. Charles was released sometime in 2018 and is still free as far as I know. He has maintained his innocence, always proclaiming that his DNA had been planted inside the victim's house. Charles Kreider would be named as a suspect at some point in this investigation after the next batch of officers had taken over. Gary Stantle was the lead investigator and Tammy Ferrari was the bureau agent. They would obtain a warrant to search a well in Kreider's old house after they got a tip that's where he buried Ashley Freeman and Laura Bible. Nothing turned up and it seemed to be a dead end. And it would seem Kreider was not involved. Although there are rumors that the girls are actually underneath his basement. Welch, Oklahoma and surrounding towns like Chitopa and Wyandotte were actually saturated with drugs, namely crystal meth. So many people were smoking it and shooting it up. And with that came the names of some violent and shady people. Chester Shadwick was a meth cook from Wyandotte and he was as cold as they come. He was on the police's radar and police obtained a warrant to search his property in 2001. Supposedly a sex tape of a local couple that kept switching hands made its way into Shadwick's possession. But the thing about this tape wasn't the sex, but what came after the sex. It was reported by an inmate that knew about the tape that the ending contained a teenage girl with dirty blonde hair being tied up. And he recognized the girl from the news. Also, a different informant claimed Shadwick had a 55-gallon drum on his property that contained a human leg bone. Unfortunately, nothing of use was found on the property. Two other dangerous men from Wyandotte at the time of the girl's disappearance was a father-son duo named Paul Glover Sr. and Jr. There were multiple reports of people saying they were the ones who did the killings and that the girls were seen on their property shortly after the disappearance and that they weren't acting right. However, nothing could be substantiated. By 2007, there seemed to be a break in the case. There was a man who had confessed to kidnapping and murdering the girls. His name was Jeremy Jones and he was in Mobile, Alabama at the time. He was a fugitive and was just picked up by the police and was facing charges after raping and killing a woman. Jones started to admit to other crimes too. He was in the area of Welch at the time. He says he was going to collect a drug debt from Danny for a friend of his. Things went south and he ended up killing Danny and Kathy and taking the girls with him. He says he did not rape the teenagers but ended up shooting them dead shortly after and throwing them down a mine shaft. But when it came down to details of the crime and the scene, Jones was having trouble getting things right and keeping his story straight. After interrogating him for an hour, Jones and the interrogators would take a smoke break outside. During the break, the police were suspected to feed Jeremy facts about the case. When they came back inside to start recording again, all of a sudden Jeremy could remember all kinds of details surrounding the crime that he couldn't remember before. In the end, Jeremy would admit that his confession was false. He liked the notoriety of being a serial killer and the attention that came with it. He was definitely a murderer. He just hadn't killed all the people he said he did. Also, he says he made the confession because it allowed him to have phone privileges, and it was possible he could be transported from Alabama to an Oklahoman prison. There were also dangerous meth cooks and fiends who would cook out of the town of Pitcher, Oklahoma. Pitcher, Oklahoma was such a toxic town with lead and zinc poisoning that if you stepped foot in it today, you could be arrested immediately. One man that cooked out of there was Phil Welch, who would use and manufacture crystal meth. He would use a second home to make his product in nearby town Pitcher, which was literally a ghost town and uninhabitable. This guy was truly evil. He would quote scriptures and preach nonstop to his friends David Pennington and Ronnie Busick. But behind closed doors, Phil would tie up his girlfriends to the ceiling sometimes and sexually assault them. He would also abuse his many children, and Phil would have them do sick things as well. He once forced his kids to beat up a mentally challenged kid who was a neighbor to them, and if they didn't comply, Phil would beat them himself. Private investigators Pryor and Dugan picked Welch up on the street one day just to have a friendly chat. When one of the PI matter-of-factly brought up the missing girls, Welch said that those two little bitches are probably in a mine shaft somewhere. His friend David Pennington was not all rainbows and sunshine either. He was violent and he would beat the hell out of his wife any chance he got. He was heavily into meth. He would eventually turn his life around before 2010 and be genuinely religious, or so it would seem. He would die in 2015, and on his deathbed, he would claim that Charles Kreider was involved in the murders of the Freemans and disappearances of the teenage girls. That is what prompted authorities to conduct a search on Kreider's property. but unfortunately it yielded no results. Ronnie Busick was a pervert who would make sexual references and innuendo to small children, including his own niece. He was a meth head and he would be in jail all throughout his life on drug charges. His siblings would not allow him to be alone with their children because he would say inappropriate sexual things to them constantly, and they could not rule out the fact that he was capable of molestation or rape. As it would turn out, Phil Welch, David Pennington, and Ronnie Busick were likely to be the ones that went to Danny's trailer a week before the murders, and they were determined to be the ones who killed the Freemans and kidnapped and murdered Ashley and Laura. In 2018, 66-year-old Ronnie Busick was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Welch and Pennington would be charged too, but Welch had died in 2007 and Pennington in 2015. By 2016, tips had started flooding into a Facebook page that Lauria Bible had set up. Also, Ronnie Busick had a big mouth. He told multiple people of what they had done and would show pictures of the girls tied up to people. Ex-girlfriends of Welch would also report that Welch had multiple Polaroid pictures of himself, posing with the girls who were bound. The trio would assault the girls before eventually killing them. It is not known when exactly they were killed. David Pennington turned his life around according to family members before succumbing to COPD, but some things are just not forgivable. Welch was always a monster and never changed. If they are burning right now, it is probably what they deserve. And it won't be long until Busick joins them as well. He was eventually convicted of accessory to murder after he accepted a plea deal in 2020. He was sentenced to 10 years. He doesn't look to be in the best of health right now, and there's a good chance he will die in prison where he belongs. As part of David Pennington's deathbed confession, he said the girls were buried under Busick's wine cellar. In 2021, police obtained a warrant to search, but no bodies were ever found. Ronnie Busick lived long enough to be caught. This is one sick dude. His niece has claimed when she was 8, Uncle Ronnie was receiving fellatio from a crackhead. Ronnie winked at his niece and then waved her over. His intentions were most likely not pure. Fortunately, his niece ran away from him. He would also joke with that same niece that she is the perfect height to give him oral sex, and he could rest his beer on her head if it was flat. Wow, Ronnie, you are certainly a piece of work. Busick admits he is part of what happened to the Freemans and the girls, but of course he minimizes his involvement and puts most of the blame on Welch and Pennington. For a long time after he was arrested, his whole demeanor was to try to gain sympathy like he was an innocent victim, playing dumb like I didn't do nothing, I don't know nothing. We do know that the confrontation had to do with drugs, but it's not known exactly what transpired and how it led to murder and kidnapping. It was probably drug-fueled though, since the guys were constantly high on meth at the time. Busick looks pitiful, but I don't think he is truly remorseful. He will never stop to think of what Lauria has gone through and try to put himself in her shoes for 1 second. And Lauria is still in limbo. She still doesn't have her daughter back to bury properly. Busick will never put himself in Ashley and Laura's shoes. He contributed to torturing them. I doubt he thought about them then and now. I can't imagine what they went through. The terror, the darkness, the physical pain. This story is always in my mind. I always think about what the girls had to endure and how much they suffered. Lauria Bible, a gifted creative writer who had so much potential. Ashley Freeman, the last one of the Freemans whose life was cut short. Lauria Bible still holds on to hope that one day her daughter will be found. So do Ashley Freeman's family.
In 2015, I took a different approach to trying to find my daughter, and I started using the online media, which really sparked where we are today in 3 years. Because it wasn't the older generation, it was their children and grandchildren that says, I might know something. and it's due to their efforts coming out that we're able to move forward. But there are people out there, I still feel in my heart that they know something, however little it might be to them. It's like a puzzle piece. But somebody knows where these girls are. And for me, I need to bring my daughter home. I need a place that I can go and say that's where my daughter is. I used to go to the end of the Freeman's driveway and I'd put up wreaths. But it's just a driveway. You know, when you lose a loved one, you can go to a cemetery. I don't have that. And that's what I want.